By the time anyone looked closely, the beavers were gone. What remained was water. High in Idaho's Chamberlain Basin, where cold tributaries run into the Middle Fork Salmon River, researchers found ponds, old dam lines, willow corridors, and meadow scars spread across country that had once been written off as too remote, too dry, too broken to manage. The animals that built them had dropped out of the sky in 1948. 76 North American beavers, wooden crates, silk parachutes, a wilderness nobody expected to watch for long. The film reels survived, the paperwork survived, the landscape survived, and after 77 years, one question still sat in the mud: what exactly did those beavers leave behind? The answer was buried in a landscape that had already forgotten its own damage. Long before the old dam lines hardened into grass, Chamberlain Basin had been stripped down to runoff, rock, and speed. Snowmelt came off the ridges fast. It did not stay. By midsummer, the smaller channels feeding the Middle Fork Salmon River ran thin and warm. That was the first loss. The second was wood. Across central Idaho, North American beavers had been trapped hard through the late 1800s and early 1900s. By the 1940s, many of the animals left near roads, ranches, and small settlements were not living where the land needed them most. They were living where people could see them and where people complained. In the backcountry, the absence was quieter. Willow stands stayed cropped low. Wet meadows shrank. Banks that once held water through August began to crack by July. A creek can die without disappearing. It just stops lingering. Game wardens knew the pattern. So did Forest Service men riding the basin on horseback. They saw the same thing in different forms: channels cutting deeper, spring water leaving faster, and broad valley bottoms turning into dry crossings by late season. The country still looked wild. That made the damage harder to notice. A healthy wilderness can hide a broken hydrology for years. Then the complaints started from the other direction. In towns and settled valleys in western Idaho, beavers were plugging culverts, felling ornamental trees, and flooding ditches. Idaho Fish and Game had a problem in duplicate. Too many beavers where roads existed, too few where water was failing. That mismatch sat there for years. Nobody had a clean way to solve it. Horses could move a few animals, but not far enough. Trucks could get close, but not into the Frank Church country that would later be named and protected. Chamberlain Basin was the kind of place that made every mile count twice. Then one detail surfaced in the files: not a dam, not a pond, a transport note. It suggested that the real obstacle was no longer the beavers. It was the distance. The distance was real. Chamberlain Basin sat more than 60 miles from the nearest road access point. Horses could carry 2 beavers at most 1 crate per animal, lashed to a pack frame. At that rate, moving 76 animals into the backcountry would take weeks. The animals would lose condition in transit. Some would not survive the journey. Elmo Heter, a fur manager with Idaho Fish and Game, had been thinking about the problem differently. He had watched military supply operations during the war years. He knew what a parachute could carry. His proposal, written in late 1947, was 3 pages long. It suggested dropping beavers from a small aircraft into Chamberlain Basin using wooden crates attached to surplus parachutes. The logic was straightforward. The animals would be crated individually. The crates would be designed to open on impact, releasing the beaver unharmed onto the ground. Heter tested the concept first with a single beaver he named Geronimo. Geronimo made the drop 4 times. Each time, the crate opened cleanly. Each time, the beaver walked away. On the 4th drop, Geronimo was loaded with the first group of animals and did not return to the holding facility. The field notes recorded his release with a single dry line. Geronimo, becoming an old, experienced parachutist, was again included. The full operation ran across several days in late August 1948. 76 beavers. Surplus military parachutes. A Piper Cub aircraft flying low over the Frank Church wilderness. Idaho Fish and Game filed the paperwork, stored the film reels, and turned its attention to other problems. Nobody scheduled a return visit. Nobody built a monitoring program. The basin was remote. The animals were gone. And for the next 7 decades, Chamberlain Basin was left entirely alone with whatever the beavers had decided to do with it. The first person to go looking was not a wildlife biologist. He was a graduate student who found the original film reels in a state archive in Boise by accident while searching for something else entirely. The graduate student's name was Ben Goldfarb. He was researching beaver history in the American West for a book on freshwater ecology. The film reels were labeled in pencil, faded, stored in a cardboard box that had not been opened since the Eisenhower administration. When he watched the footage, he saw the Piper Cub, the wooden crates, the parachutes opening over a green basin ringed by Idaho ridgelines. He also noticed something in the background of one frame, a pond, already formed, already holding water, in a location where the 1948 survey maps had recorded only dry meadow. The beavers had been in the air for less than 4 minutes. That pond was not supposed to exist yet. Goldfarb cross-referenced the frame against current satellite imagery of Chamberlain Basin. The coordinates matched. The pond was still there, larger, deeper, ringed by willows 20 feet tall. He contacted the U.S. Forest Service and asked a simple question. Had anyone surveyed Chamberlain Basin for beaver activity since 1948? The answer came back in 2 days. No formal survey had ever been conducted. In 77 years, no wildlife agency had returned to the exact release coordinates to document what the animals had built. The Forest Service agreed to fund a ground survey. A 4-man team flew into the basin by small aircraft in the summer of 2025. They carried GPS units, water testing equipment, and printed copies of the 1948 release coordinates. The lead researcher later said he expected to find remnant dam structures. Old work, collapsed, overgrown, evidence of a population that had peaked and quietly disappeared. What the GPS led them to instead stopped the team on the trail before they reached the first release point. The sound reached them before the water did. The sound was water. Moving water, not the thin trickle of a mountain creek running over loose rock, something heavier, the kind of sound that fills a valley and bounces off the tree line before you can locate its source. The lead researcher, a hydrologist named Dr. Scott Larson from the University of Idaho, stopped walking and checked his GPS. They were still 400 meters from the first 1948 release coordinate. The sound was already surrounding them. They pushed through a stand of willow dense, tall, completely blocking the view ahead, and stepped out onto the edge of something that was not on any map they had brought. A pond, roughly 2 hectares in surface area. Still, dark called the dam holding it stretched 43 meters across the channel, constructed from interlocked willow branches, packed mud, and river stone. It was not old work. Fresh mud was visible along the crown. Something had repaired this dam within the last 2 weeks. Larson waded the edge of the pond and checked the water temperature, 8 degrees Celsius. In late July, in a basin where unmanaged creek temperatures had been recorded at 18 degrees or higher during summer surveys in the 1990s. The beavers had not just built a pond, they had cooled an entire section of the watershed by 10 degrees. The team moved upstream. Every 300 to 400 meters, another dam, another pond, another section of channel transformed from fast-moving shallow runoff into slow, deep, cold storage. By the end of the first day, the team had documented 31 active dam structures along a 6-mile corridor. 31, built and maintained by a population that had never been counted, never been managed, and never been checked. The survey equipment recorded what the maps had missed for 7 decades. Water retention in the Chamberlain Basin corridor was running at 61% of annual precipitation. In 1948, before the drop, Forest Service estimates had placed that figure at under 15%. The beavers had quadrupled the watershed's capacity to hold water across 77 years of zero human involvement. Then came the species data. Motion cameras set along the pond edges on the second night recorded Chinook salmon holding in the cold deep water below the largest dam structure. Chinook salmon, a species that Idaho Fish and Game had stopped recording in this particular tributary during surveys conducted in 1987. They had not been reintroduced. Nobody had stocked them. They had followed the cold water up from the Middle Fork Salmon River, the same river the beavers had been cooling and slowing for 3/4 of a century. Larson sat with that data for a long time before he wrote anything down. He later described the moment in a field note that made it into the published survey report. He wrote, "The salmon did not come back because we helped them. They came back because we stayed away." But the most significant finding was not the salmon. It was not the temperature reading. it was not the 31 dams. It was a single soil core extracted from a meadow at the upper end of the beaver complex, a meadow that 1948 aerial photographs had shown as bare, compacted, dry ground. The core was 1 meter deep. The top 60 centimeters were rich, dark, organic wetland soil built entirely from sediment trapped behind beaver dams over 77 years of uninterrupted work. 60 centimeters of new earth, created by animals that arrived in wooden boxes from the back of a Piper Cub aircraft and were never seen again by the agency that dropped them. The survey team flew out of Chamberlain Basin on the 4th day. They carried soil samples, water data, salmon photographs, and one question that the data alone could not answer. If 76 beavers had done all of this in a wilderness, nobody watched how many other places had been quietly healing in exactly the same way. The question did not stay unanswered for long. Within 3 months of the Chamberlain Basin survey, Dr. Larsen's team submitted their findings to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The report ran to 62 pages. The executive summary ran to 1 paragraph. It stated that a single unmonitored beaver population, established through aerial translocation in 1948, had produced measurable hydrological restoration across a 6-mile watershed corridor without any subsequent human intervention. Water retention had increased fourfold. A locally absent salmon run had self-restored. 60 centimeters of wetland soil had been generated from bare compacted ground. All of it in 77 years of being left alone. The report was circulated to 14 state wildlife agencies across the American West. It landed on desks in Oregon, Wyoming, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, and Montana. Every one of those states had conducted beaver translocation programs at some point between 1930 and 1980. Few had maintained systematic follow-up surveys. Several had none at all. The implication was direct, and nobody in those offices needed it spelled out. There were other Chamberlain Basins, watersheds that had received animals and been forgotten. Remote drainages where beavers had been working in silence for 40, 50, 60 years building dams nobody counted. Cooling water nobody measured. Pulling salmon back into channels nobody thought to check. The U.S. Forest Service responded by commissioning aerial surveys of 17 wilderness drainages across Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming locations where historical translocation records existed, but post-release monitoring was absent or incomplete. The surveys began in spring 2025. Preliminary results from the first 4 drainages were released internally in August. 3 of the 4 showed active beaver populations. 2 showed self-restored riparian vegetation covering areas larger than the Chamberlain Basin complex. 1 drainage in the Bitterroot Wilderness of Montana showed beaver dam structures extending across 11 miles of creek corridor, a population that agency records suggested had been established from a 12-animal drop conducted in 1961. 12 animals, 64 years, 11 miles. No management, no budget, no oversight. The Bitterroot drainage had not been surveyed since the year of the original release. Larsen, reviewing the aerial photographs from his office in Moscow, Idaho, described the image in a single line during a recorded interview. He said it looked like someone had drawn a green river through a mountain range that had forgotten what green felt like. The 1948 Chamberlain Basin operation was not designed to be a long-term experiment. It was a logistic solution to a nuisance animal problem. Nobody planned for 77 years. Nobody budgeted for Chinook salmon. Nobody wrote a management objective that included 60 centimeters of new soil. Elmo Heter filed his paperwork, watched his Piper Cub make its final pass over the basin, and went back to his office. He died in 1973. He never returned to Chamberlain Basin. He never saw what Geronimo built. What the 2025 survey established quietly, in the language of soil cores and water temperature readings and salmon photographs taken at midnight, is something that land managers in 30 countries are now being asked to consider seriously. The most effective restoration tool available to a damaged watershed is not a budget. It is not a replanting program. It is not a government directive or a decade-long management plan. It is an animal that has been doing this work for 10,000 years and the discipline to leave it alone long enough to finish. 76 beavers, 1 aircraft, 77 years of silence, and a watershed that remembered everything the agency had forgotten. If you want to keep finding the stories that the maps have not caught up with, yet this channel is where they surface.